But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I have a couple of email alerts set up for various criminals or suspects, mostly high profile. But one of the more unusual alerts I've set up is for Vincent van Gogh. And I recently got an alert based on the death of the legendary American actor Kirk Douglas. Now I know what you're thinking. What does Kirk Douglas or Vincent van Gogh have to do with true crime? Well, actually quite a lot. But let's start with Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas was born about a month after the end of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. He was born 26 years after the death of Vincent van Gogh. When Kirk Douglas portrayed Vincent van Gogh, he received one of 3 Oscar nominations. And that came out, that was based on a book that came out 40 years after Kirk Douglas was born. So in about 1955, a book came out, and then the movie was based on the book, and it was called Lustful Life. And we're going to be talking about his portrayal of the Lustful Life story in some detail. I'll also be playing 3 clips from the movie, and then you will see and feel the true crime aspect to it. Just to go into a little bit more detail into Kirk Douglas, he grew up very, very poor in New York. And it's kind of a rags to riches story. You know, he started off extremely poor and became probably one of the top actors in Hollywood in his time. He sort of rose in the golden age of cinema. And one can see why he wanted to play Vincent van Gogh, just because I think he identified with his struggle, as many artists do. And what is incredible is how Kirk Douglas's portrayal of Van Gogh led to Van Gogh becoming a legend himself, I guess. Van Gogh becoming a legend pretty much, about 100 years after his death. So it was as a result of this movie that everything kind of started happening for the late artist, the Dutch artist. I'm going to be dealing with the movie in a second, but I just want to complete this. How it started for Kirk Douglas was he started wanting to become an actor in the 2nd grade when he played a shoemaker in a school play. So he played a very humble role, and his mother made him a black apron. And then after his performance, his father, well, this is what Kirk Douglas said. He said, "My father gave me my first Oscar, an ice cream cone." So after performing in this little school play, his father gave him an ice cream, and that little encounter, that little thing, recognition from his father, the whole reward from the ice cream cone at such a young age made a huge impression on him. And he then, took that whole thing and made a career out of it. And I want to refer you to a letter from February the 17th, 1993. It was a letter written by Kirk Douglas. Obviously, by this time, his screen legend was fully established. And what happened was he replied to a letter from an Irishman, in fact, an Irish student at Trinity College in Dublin, who wrote to Kirk Douglas to ask him to curate a season of his films at his university. And unexpectedly, Kirk Douglas wrote back to the student, and basically what he said is, I've made 80 films, but one day when I was reviewing them, I only found 25 that I'm proud of. And he said, of course, that means there are a lot of films that I really don't like very much. So around about 55 films, most of the films he made, he wasn't very happy with. And I was very interested in this letter because I was wondering whether Lustful Life would feature as one of those 5 films. And so it turned out that it did. He chose 5 five films. The first one that he mentioned as his favorite films that meant something to him was his breakout movie Champion, where he starred as a boxer on the skids. And interestingly enough, boxing kind of comes up in the Van Gogh story. Then Lustful Life, he gave a very energetic and, as I say, Oscar-nominated performance as Vincent van Gogh. And so Kirk Douglas sort of had an air of humility about him. He came from humble beginnings, but he sort of maintained a kind of a humility throughout his life. And he sort of signed his letter off saying, I'm anxious to know how people respond to this program. Maybe I'll become a better filmmaker. And I don't mean to be nasty when I say this. I mean, I don't mean to, this isn't to make a dig at Kirk Douglas at all. I want to basically look at the way that Vincent van Gogh was portrayed in 1955 in that movie, and what that led to, the legend of Vincent van Gogh that kind of ignited. That's what I want to kind of analyze, and really in 2 areas. I want to really look at 2 aspects that involved crimes and that involved the French police, to Vincent van Gogh's bedside, and what we can see and what we can say about that in terms of true crime rocket science. Now, bear in mind what we're doing here is we're reviewing a dramatic depiction, almost like a Lifetime movie, I guess, in the modern sense, of Kirk Douglas portraying Vincent van Gogh in around about the 1950s. That's what we're looking at. So we're looking at a dramatic portrayal out of history. Okay. And what I want you to bear in mind is that Kirk Douglas felt that this was one of his best or better roles, one of the 5 best portrayals he did in a career spanning 80 movies, right? I kind of know, I think, a little bit of what he's talking about, just because I've written 97 books, and I can tell you there are a couple of books that I'm very, very happy with and some that I'm very unhappy with. Obviously, I wouldn't say I would kill, but I would do a lot to get the kind of influence and renown that Kirk Douglas got. In fact, it's a regular joke I make with my friends and with people who know me that, I'm gonna die like Vincent van Gogh. I'm gonna be, my work's gonna, I wish, become famous, when I'm no longer here. And so I really want to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's in a way a kind of a dumb joke, because I've obviously sold quite a lot of books, whereas Vincent van Gogh, didn't really sell that much. Of course, now is one of the world's most amazing success stories. I don't have any delusions that my work's going to compare to that kind of success. Just that I would prefer a little bit more recognition, I guess, in my life than I don't know, than I'm, I guess, not enjoying at the moment. And that was something that ate at Vincent van Gogh his whole life, that people just didn't recognize what he was doing, didn't know what he was doing, and all that kind of thing. I don't want to make this about me, though. I want to make it about how this movie misunderstood Vincent van Gogh, even half a century later, even after books were written, even after all the letters that came out were known. And that's the part that I want to focus on. So a true crime analysis of how even the criminal aspect against him was misunderstood. And if you'll forgive me, it is very personal to me. I very much identify with Van Gogh's story, so much so I went to France last year. I traveled through Arles, where he lived for a couple of years of his life. I traveled to Auvers-sur-Oise. I went to his gravesite. I went to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. I went to Newnan, where he was, where he grew up as a child. And it goes a lot deeper than that. There's a lot of art in my family, going back to my grandfather. My grandfather comes from the Netherlands. My grandfather actually was invited by the Queen of Holland to paint at the palace. So, it was kind of a big deal. My great-grandfather also painted a portrait of Paul Kruger. So there is a little bit of connectedness to not necessarily Van Gogh per se, but to the journey of the artist in terms of literally through the Netherlands. And there's also a little bit of backstory connecting the geography. My great-grandfather was a Dutch guy, painted South African landscapes, and one of Van Gogh's brothers, Cor, came to South Africa, and he actually died not far from where I'm sitting right now, probably half an hour's drive from where I'm sitting right now, and maybe an hour. And so, yeah, his brother also had a tragic fate. I've also written a book called The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, and I'll be telling a little bit more about that and another book that's coming at the end of this episode. But let's get started with Lustful Life.
Your father is a minister, is he not?
I'm not trying to put myself on a level with my father. I only hoped in some way to follow in his footsteps. And
Yet, until a year ago, you showed no inclination or desire to follow your father's calling.
believe me, this is something I have to do. I want to help the unfortunates. I want to bring them the word of God. Even if I'm not qualified, there must be some way I can serve. Isn't there any place for me, somewhere no one else wants to go? I'll do anything, only use me. Use me.
Come here. Do you know this part of the country?
No.
It's a coal mining region, the Borinage. There exists no more miserable people on the face of the earth than the miners who live there. If you really mean what you said about wanting to help the unfortunates, here's your chance.
Right, so that little piece of drama is certainly accurate. Vincent van Gogh was the son of a preacher. He didn't start off being particularly interested in the gospel. In fact, he seemed to be a little bit of a rebel. He did start off kind of as an art dealer. He trained as an art dealer as quite a young kind of apprentice. He then moved to London, which at the time was the world's biggest city. And he worked there, and it was quite an astonishing experience for him. He started reading Shakespeare and reading Charles Dickens and so on. and Emile Zola. And while he was there, he kind of became interested kind of in the poor people he saw around him, and he became interested in becoming a preacher. Anyway, long story short, he eventually preached in the Borinage, which is a very grim region in Belgium, and he kind of became almost like a messianic figure. He sort of slept on straw, and he would draw pictures and then burn them, for light and for kindling. And he went down into the mines and lived with these people, and it was a very sort of humble life. And eventually he was so sort of humble that he was smelling, and the people who kind of hired him to do this job eventually kicked him out. They didn't want him to be that sort of humble, if that makes sense. Anyway, let's go to another depiction, and this is a depiction of an argument that Vincent van Gogh has with the artist Paul Gauguin, and this happens in the Yellow House. This is in Arles, and this happens shortly before Christmas, around about that time in 1889. So just over 130 years ago, and this was sort of when this argument happened. It was, sorry, not 130 years ago, 132 years ago. It happened in the end of 1888. And after playing back that dramatization, I'm going to play another one, which is the kind of aftermath to that. And then I'm going to also read a letter that Vincent van Gogh wrote to his brother just a few days later, on Friday the 4th of January 1889. But I want you to listen to the dramatization and just think about what you know about Vincent van Gogh in the context of what you're about to hear. Okay, here we go.
For weeks I've been listening to that slop, and I'm tired of it. What do you know about toil? When have you done a stroke of manual labor in your life? Well, I have. I've dug ditches in the stinking heat of the tropics. I worked in the docks in weather so cold my hands froze to the ropes. And I can tell you there's nothing noble or beautiful about it. I did it so I could go on painting. I didn't have a brother to support me. Don't ever do that again.
Paul, where are you going?
I'm getting out of here before one of us gets killed.
Don't go,
I'll be back
Paul.
with my things in the morning.
Please don't go, Paul. If you only knew how lonely I was before you came here.
I know all about loneliness. Only I don't whine about it.
So all of this quite obviously is something you need to see, something you need to bear in mind the history of, because there is history, something that you can look at the letters of Vincent van Gogh to find out what happened, something you can read biographies about. You can also read Gauguin's account of what's going on here, and this is Gauguin's account. Later in the sort of depiction, you see Vincent sort of stumbling down a dark alley with a razor in his hand, right? And so what's being depicted here is him and Gauguin have kind of argued, although it's more like Gauguin has told him to go to hell, basically, and Vincent van Gogh's very much the pathetic figure. He's sort of desperate to keep his friendship, is desperately lonely, and Gauguin then just sort of, I won't say abandons him, but he just leaves. And then in the depiction, Vincent is so upset that he sort of goes out with a razor and sort of walks up behind Gauguin, and then Gauguin turns, and then Vincent also turns and goes home. that's literally what's depicted. That's also the story, one of the stories Gauguin gave of this. I talk about it quite a lot in The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, just the two different accounts that Gauguin gave, and also kind of how ridiculous it is, just in the sense that you have them arguing, and Gauguin kind of being the stronger guy, sort of setting the trend or setting the tone. He then leaves, and then you sort of have this sort of non-event where nobody sees it happen except Gauguin. You sort of see Vincent sort of skulking down the alley, as I say, with a razor, and then he just goes back the same way with nothing actually happening. He doesn't say anything. Gauguin doesn't say anything. No one hears anything. There's no assault. There's just this sort of silent movie kind of going on. And then, it's also, you've got to think, why would Vincent be angry or violent as a result of this? Was it because he was told? And even in the dramatization, you sort of have Gauguin saying, I don't have a brother giving me money. And then this is supposed to make Vincent angry. Well, maybe he was embarrassed at getting handouts from his brother. And this is an aspect that's misunderstood about Vincent. A lot of people thought he had no money, or that he was very poor, when that money was his inheritance from his father, which his brother was giving to him in stipends, right, in regular kind of amounts. And it meant that he was able to live as an artist because of these amounts. It wasn't so much Theo being generous, it was Theo giving Vincent his share of his inheritance, but at a gradual rate, if that makes sense. There's more to say about that, but the other aspect that's not actually accurate in this depiction is where Gauguin says, what do you know about toil? I dug ditches and I did this and I did that. It's not really true. Gauguin, if you go and check his backstory, was kind of a dude from privilege. He was kind of a banker. So, this whole thing about that is somewhat true, but most of that really happened after he left, after the Yellow House period. So it's not strictly, if you're going to compare toil between Gauguin and Van Gogh, it's not really a comparison. Vincent was he was a guy who painted outside and he went for walks, whereas Gauguin painted inside and he sort of painted sort of exotic themes that were out of his mindscape, whereas Van Gogh painted the landscape. Van Gogh painted what was in front of him and he went to these places, whereas Gauguin painted scenes from his mind, and he very much painted indoors, and he took a long time to execute his paintings, whereas Van Gogh did them very, very quickly, like in flourishes, and so they argued a lot about this kind of thing. And Vincent was looking for a little bit of exposure and recognition, and I guess a little bit of friendship as well. But because Gauguin was a little bit more established and had started selling his art, Vincent was desperate to sort of rub shoulders a little bit with him. And there was kind of a three-way alliance and a three-way contract between Vincent, Gauguin, and his brother, where they were sort of trying to start up a kind of a painter's retreat in Arles, but also develop kind of a business where this was going to lead to kind of a business arrangement. And so the breakdown of their relationship kind of led to a financial crisis for the Van Gogh brothers, because this was like their ticket. And when it came to Theo was sort of more likely to stick with his investment that was going to work in terms of the painting, which is Gauguin, and not his brother. There's more to say about that, but what I'm trying to sort of hint at a little bit is, does this look like a situation where does this look like a credible, believable situation where these guys would argue? And Gauguin was a boxer, so that's something he did sort of for fun, right? As I say, he was a guy who came from privilege. And the other thing that he did, that he was a hobby, was fencing. He had swords, he had fencing equipment. And so Gauguin kind of has this story where they have an argument. He leaves, pretty much just like politely leaving. And Vincent then sort of approaches him with a small little razor in his hand, like, I'm going to now take you on. And there's no evidence that Vincent was a kind of I'm talking about physically sort of fighting with people besides this. I'm not saying Vincent was the easiest guy to get along with, but he certainly wasn't a guy who would become physically violent and confrontational in that sense. He might argue and he might disagree and he might get emotional, but he wasn't a guy who would have kind of physical confrontations or brawls or anything like that. Whereas Gauguin was that kind of guy. I mean, why do you think he took up boxing and fencing? Because he was that kind of guy. So just something to bear in mind. And now we're going to go to the aftermath, which is and interestingly, in the depiction where Kirk Douglas acts that he's cutting off his own ear, you don't actually see it. You see him looking into a mirror, and then the next thing you kind of hear a scream, and obviously it's being implied that he's cutting off his own ear. But interestingly, they don't actually depict it. And I think there's a little bit of reality. There's a little bit of a hole in understanding about how it happened, why it happened, and actually who did it. Okay, and now we go to the aftermath where Gauguin arrives back. So it's kind of like Vincent's now lost his ear. He's almost literally bled to death through the night because he cut an artery was cut in his ear, and the next day his bed is covered in blood and he's barely alive. And you have a situation where Gauguin arrives back supposedly innocently, like, oh, what happened? Everyone is there, like the cops are there, the city, the townsfolk of all are gathered under the sort of window, like a crowd, like, what's going on here? It's like a big. This is like a big event for the town. And the last guy to know was Gauguin. It's like, oh, what happened here? And Gauguin lives there. And so you now have this dramatized scene of Gauguin stepping back into his own home, and the cops are there and they're sort of asking a couple of questions. So let's listen to that.
What happened? His ear's been slashed off. What went on last night?
I don't know. I wasn't here.
You live here. Why did you leave? Did you two have a fight?
Look,
The doctor is here. Inspector.
Right this way, Doctor.
When did you find him?
About an hour ago.
Has he been conscious at all?
Not at all.
It's a wonder he didn't bleed to death.
Self-inflicted, Doctor?
Looks that way.
What do you think, Doc?
Well, don't worry. You won't have a corpse on your hand. The thing is to get it cauterized and clean. Turn down. Water and towels, please.
Right away, sir.
you might as well know.
That man's unbalanced.
Don't take my word for it. Ask anyone around. Last night he got worse. Just my being here seemed to drive him out of his mind. If I'm here when he comes to and he sees me after all that's happened, it could be fatal to him. Will you need me for anything more?
No, I guess not.
I'll notify his brother.
So a couple of things to comment on here. Again, you see Gauguin arriving. The cops sort of talk to him. They a little bit suspicious. They're sort of like, well, you live here. How come you don't know what went on here? And he admits that they had an argument. And then kind of very quickly, Gauguin skips town. He's like, wow, this is too much for me. I'm out of here. And he kind of packs his bags and he's gone. Now, what we know from history, what we know from reality, what we know from the letters is he didn't just leave like that. He actually took quite a few of Van Gogh's paintings. He took a couple of the those famous sunflowers. So when he left, without his permission, without Vincent van Gogh's permission, he took some of which are today some of the most valuable artworks in the world. He took with him when he left. Now, what's interesting is Van Gogh this is before Gauguin arrived, and actually for a long time he sent letters to Gauguin saying, please come here, please come visit me, please come and join me in this artistic crusade. It's going to be awesome. And Gauguin didn't really want to do it, and it took a lot of convincing. And eventually, when Gauguin was so down on his luck, he did agree to join him. Now, obviously, for payment and for certain sort of he made certain sort of undertakings to Theo, right? But in this preparatory phase where Gauguin was going to join Vincent, and he sort of changed his mind a few times and postponed and so on. But anyway, Van Gogh was led to believe that he was coming, and so what Vincent then did was he kind of prepared the house. He painted it yellow, and he painted sort of a lot of a couple of paintings which were to await the arrival of Gauguin. He sort of got really excited, and part of that sort of manifested in him painting kind of a series of paintings about these sunflowers. So he painted the interior of the house yellow, and I think the exterior is yellow as well. And then he painted all these sunflowers, and it was kind of a gesture of, to welcome Gauguin. I'm not sure if it's that clear or explicit that all of these paintings were a gift to Gauguin. Maybe one of them were, but there's definitely a sense that Gauguin left and he took more than was really his. And he also left a couple of things behind. One of the things he left behind was his fencing equipment, interestingly enough, ironically enough. In any event, he skipped town pretty quickly. It didn't happen the way it's depicted here. It wasn't as if Gauguin just sort of picked up his bags and walked out the door. As I say, he took some paintings and if memory serves me, I could be wrong about this, but if memory serves, Theo came down very, very quickly from Paris, and at quite a lot of expense. To do a trip like that was quite a big deal. And he kind of looked in on his brother, and then he left again. Theo coming down was more kind of about chaperoning Gauguin back with him to Paris. So you'd imagine that Theo was coming to see his brother, but in another way he was kind of trying to repair and preserve his relationship with Gauguin. I'm talking about Theo trying to preserve his relationship with Gauguin. And so you had a kind of a weird situation where, even though the one brother had been injured, the other brother sort of was like, "Oh, are you okay? Okay, fine. Okay, I'm going to take Gauguin back to where he needs to go. I'm going to sort of look after him." And so even though Theo came all the way down to Arles, he didn't really hang around long, and he was sort of back on the train like a day or two later, which tells you a little bit about the sort of somewhat tenuous relationship between the Van Gogh brothers, and also their relationship with Gauguin. Gauguin, I think both brothers saw Gauguin as their ticket to the big time. And we know Gauguin also became a very well-known artist ultimately. So, that's definitely an interesting aspect that's sort of missing. What you also see with the inspector is that he's not sure of what is going on here. He's like, doctor, what do you think happened here? Do you think this is self-inflicted? And the doctor, I think, says yes. And that's kind of a question. It is, what happened here? Is this self-inflicted, or did something else happen? And now bear in mind, it's in the it's within the background of an argument. These two artists have an argument, and next thing, Gauguin's gone. So do you really think it was self-inflicted? And that's something I deal with in The Murder of Vincent van Gogh. The other aspect is when Vincent van Gogh was found with a gunshot wound, the same question arose again. Do you think this is self-inflicted? And Theo was also faced with this scenario. Is this self-inflicted, or did something else happen? And it was also within this context of interests and, other artists and various financial arrangements. And I'm not saying Vincent was innocent. I mean, he did argue with Gauguin. I'm not saying he's innocent. But I am sort of just knocking on the door a little bit to say, do you think Gauguin was completely innocent? And the same thing with his murder, the suicide. It's not as though Vincent van Gogh was innocent there either. He got into a few arguments with Dr. Gachet in Auvers. And so the question is, and this was a military doctor. This was a guy who'd been on the front line. So are you telling me that was just, another argument, and Dr. Gachet also just got fed up, and then Vincent committed suicide because he felt so bad about something? Or was he shot? So what this episode essentially is it's just letting you guys know that I'm on Patreon. I think on the $3 tier, I'm going to be taking people through what I call the last journey of Vincent van Gogh, and this year is the 130-year anniversary of that last journey. It's really dealing with the last 2 months of his life. He kind of had himself released from the asylum in Saint-Remy. It's also somewhere that I visited around about the same time last year in May. And then he took a train to Paris, and I was also in Paris in May last year. And then from there he went to Auvers, and he lived the last 2 months of his life, and he wrote a letter every single day, and he painted a picture every single day. And effectively those are like Facebook posts. It's like a diary of the last days of his life. And that diary kind of sets up the narrative. Was Vincent suicidal, or was he pissing people off? Was he making people unhappy? What was going on? What did his brother think of everything? And so in order to do justice to Vincent van Gogh's story, I want you to get to know him, and you can only get to know him through a certain amount of time, through not Facebook posts but letters. And we're gonna read his actual letters and get to know him. And bear in mind, in the same way, when you leave a Facebook post, you're not telling all the truth about yourself or your situation. You're leaking a little bit of detail. Some of what you're saying may not be the whole truth or exactly how you feel, but over time you're going to get to know him quite well, just as people got to know Shanann Watts through her Facebook posts. And by the time we get to June, we're going to be dealing with it every day for the last 70 days of his life, and then we will have a much better idea of what really happened. So that's what I'm going to be doing. By the time we get to June, that's going to be on Patreon on every single day, a new post examining each letter, culminating in the book, the last journey, or the final journey of Vincent van Gogh. Those who are interested can read the book I've written. As I say, I've visited all those places that matter in terms of the history. I went to Nuenen, which is his birthplace. I went to Amsterdam. I went to the Van Gogh Museum. And that's something I want to just highlight here before I sign off, is when you look at this movie that was made, and this movie basically established Vincent van Gogh's legend. it was only after this movie that Vincent van Gogh kind of became a household name and the person he is today. So, 65 years kind of went by where nothing really happened. And then this movie came out, and then everything happened. And he kind of became a legend in America before he became a legend in the Netherlands and the rest of the world. And it was thanks to Kirk Douglas's performance. But what I want you to look at is, if you look at the yellow museums, the yellow text highlighting the museums that they borrowed, that the movie makers borrowed artworks from. They actually borrowed the original artworks to make this film. And it's partially because they had the letters to draw from, which the book was based on, and these artworks, that they were able to make such a colorful and rich and enigmatic story. And people actually got to see these artworks in the movie, and that's how they became world famous. But if you go through the list of artworks, where is the Van Gogh Museum? Where is a single Dutch museum? And what does that tell you? It tells you that Vincent van Gogh wasn't a very well-known artist in his own country. It took another country to recognize him. It took another country to legitimize him. It took another country to kind of establish his legend and establish him as an artist. And isn't that ironic? So I will be covering all of this on Patreon, but as I say, especially in June and July of this year, which is the 130th anniversary. There's so much that I have to share just in terms of documentaries and depictions and insights and artworks, which is really amazing. And also, when I went there to Aal, just incredible little town. I think it's about 1,000 years old. Got a coliseum, and it's just an amazing little place, just full of history. And then I went to Orvais, and it's also hundreds of years old. It's got rose bushes as big as trees, and the whole place is like a garden. And that's just outside Paris. And so I'm going to be sharing photos of my journey there and my photos of the journey to the museum and just how I researched all of this on site. And I took a little bit of video of the wheat fields and of the grasses singing and some of the places, the exact places that Vincent van Gogh stood when he painted certain paintings, and just take you guys there, right? In terms of the Watts case, I've already done a little bit of work in doing this lighting video, but it wasn't the quality wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, so I'm going to be doing that again. I prefer to do it at night just so that you can get stronger lighting, shadows, and that kind of thing. So that light experiment is still on its way, so look out for that. If you're interested in this kind of authentic true crime coverage, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.